The night they threw us out, it was raining so hard the gutters on Mercer Island had turned into rivers. I remember standing at the iron gate of the Harrington estate, soaking through my formal dress in under a minute, watching the warm amber light bleeding through the tall windows of the house where I had spent every year of my life. The manicured hedges, the stone fountain still running in the dark, the silhouettes of senators and board members moving behind the glass like shadows at a puppet show. None of them knew what had just happened inside. None of them would have cared if they did. My brother Reeve was beside me. He had one hand pressed against his mouth, not crying, just holding himself together with the particular stillness he reached for when things became too large to speak about. There was a thin line of blood on his lower lip where our father's ring had caught him. He was still wearing his suit jacket, but one of the buttons had been torn clean off in the hallway struggle. It lay somewhere back there on the marble floor of Richard Harrington's study, and neither of us would ever go back to retrieve it. We were 18 years old. We had no phones, no wallets, no coats, just the clothes on our backs and the sound of the iron gate locking behind us with a finality that I can still hear, even now, in the quietest moments of the night. I want you to understand who Richard Harrington was before I tell you what he did to us, because monsters are always easier to dismiss when you don't understand how carefully they constructed their respectability. Richard was the CEO of Harrington and Low Logistics, a Seattle-based shipping conglomerate that moved billions of dollars of cargo through the ports of the Pacific Northwest every single year. He was the kind of man who appeared on the covers of regional business magazines with his jaw set at an angle that suggested both authority and vision. He gave commencement speeches at the University of Washington. He had a wing named after him at a children's hospital in Bellevue. He kept his silver hair cut close and his cufflinks polished, and his opinions delivered in the measured, unhurried cadence of a man who has never once been told no. At home, he was something else entirely. Reeve and I grew up in a glass and steel mansion perched on the western shore of Mercer Island, looking out over Lake Washington toward the Seattle skyline. From the outside, it looked like the kind of childhood that other children dreamed about. Private schools, a housekeeper named Mrs. Aldridge who made cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings, a garage with 4 cars, a greenhouse where Reeve spent hours sketching the shapes of leaves and the way light moved through glass. But the greenhouse had a lock on it. So did the library. So did most of the good things in that house, because Richard believed that access was a form of control, and control was the only language he spoke fluently. He had married our mother, Diane Vance, when we were 3 years old. She died of a cardiac event when we were 9, quietly in a hospital room that Richard had arranged to be private. We were not brought to see her. We were told afterward, in the study, with Richard sitting behind his desk as though delivering a quarterly earnings report. No service, no burial that we were permitted to attend. Just the information, delivered cleanly, and then the expectation that life would continue on schedule. After that, we became assets, not children. Assets. Reeve had a gift for visual art that Richard recognized as socially useful, the kind of thing that looked good mentioned in interviews. I was sharper with numbers and strategy, which Richard saw as directly applicable to the business. We were groomed accordingly. Private tutors. Introductions to board members at 12 years old. Firm handshakes practiced until they were perfect. What Richard never understood, or perhaps understood completely and simply chose to ignore, was that Reeve was gentle in a way that the Harrington world had no category for. He felt things deeply. He was the person who would stop on a rainy sidewalk to move a worm back to the grass. He kept a sketchbook under his mattress filled with drawings of faces, not the faces of powerful people, but of strangers on buses and old men feeding pigeons and the housekeeper's hands when she was rolling dough. He saw the world in a way that Richard found inconvenient. And so when Richard decided in the autumn of our 18th year that Reeve would be engaged to Whitmore Ashby's daughter, a business arrangement disguised as a social introduction, he did not ask. He announced. The night of November 12, 2018, should have been our birthday celebration. Richard had arranged a party, which meant Richard had arranged an audience. 300 guests filled the main floor of the estate. Politicians, shipping executives, the Seattle money that arrived in black cars and left before midnight. The official purpose was to mark our 18th birthday. The real purpose was to unveil the next phase of Richard's long-term corporate strategy, which apparently included the romantic life of his son. I was near the staircase when Richard cornered Reeve in the study. The door was heavy mahogany, but sound travels through old houses in ways that architects don't always account for. I heard Richard's voice first. Low, measured, the tone he used when he wanted compliance rather than conversation. Then I heard Reeves' voice, and it was shaking, but it was clear. He said no. In 18 years of living in that house, I had never heard anyone say that word to Richard Harrington and have it land without consequence. The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long. I know because I counted them. And then I heard the sound that I will carry for the rest of my life. The flat, hard crack of a hand against a face, and then the sound of something hitting the floor. I did not think. I simply moved. When I pushed open the study door, Reeve was on the floor with his hand over his mouth, and Richard was standing over him with his chest heaving and his face arranged in an expression that was past anger and into something colder, something clinical. He looked at Reeve on the floor the way a man looks at a machine that has stopped working. Not with fury anymore, but with the calm assessment of replacement. He did not look at me when I shoved him, both hands flat against his chest, and he went backward hard into the liquor cabinet. Crystal glasses hit the floor. A bottle of 20-year scotch shattered against the baseboard. The sound brought 2 security guards through the side door in under 10 seconds. Richard straightened his jacket. He touched the corner of his mouth where a small cut had opened. He examined it on his fingertips with the mild interest of a man discovering a minor inconvenience. Then he looked at us. "Get them out," he said. "They leave with the clothes on their backs. If they set foot on this property again, have them arrested for trespassing. They are dead to me." The guards were not rough. They didn't need to be. The weight of Richard's authority in that house was enough. We were walked through the kitchen to avoid the guests, out through the service entrance, and then through the side garden to the iron gate on the street. One of the guards held an umbrella, absurdly, over his own head as he unlocked the gate. The rain came down in cold gray sheets. The gate closed. And that was it. 18 years. Gone in the time it takes to say the sentence. I stood there for longer than I should have, just looking at the house. Not because I wanted to go back, but because my mind was still trying to catch up to the fact that the version of reality I had understood to be permanent had simply ceased to exist. Like waking up and finding that the floor is no longer where it was. Reeve touched my arm. "We should go," he said quietly. We walked to the street. We had no direction and no plan. The nearest warmth was a 24-hour diner on the ferry road 2 miles east. We walked there in the rain, in our formal clothes, and sat in a corner booth until the waitress behind the counter stopped looking at us with the particular expression of someone deciding whether to call someone. I had $4 and some change in the pocket of my dress. We ordered 2 cups of coffee and sat there until 3 in the morning, when I made the decision that would define the next 5 months of our lives. I had worked 2 summers at the garage on Rainier Avenue, a place called Russo's Auto, owned by a heavy-set man named Bill Russo, who hired under the table and asked no questions and paid cash on Fridays. Bill was 63 and had a voice like gravel and a dog named Sergeant who slept on a folded tarpaulin near the hydraulic lift. Bill had never once asked me why a girl from Mercer Island wanted to spend her summer learning to change brake pads, and I had never explained. And that mutual silence had been the foundation of something I would now have to rely on completely. I used the payphone outside the diner to call the garage number from memory. Bill picked up on the 3rd ring, which told me he was already in the bay, already working, even at that hour. "I need a place," I said, "and work. Starting now." He didn't ask what happened. He just said, "There's a cot in the parts room." For the first 3 weeks, Reeve and I slept on that cot in shifts. Then Bill let us move the Honda Civic, a 1998 two-door that I had bought for $600 the previous summer from a man in Burien, into the back corner of the lot, and we slept in the car instead, which gave us a small degree of privacy and felt, in the strange accounting of that period, like a significant improvement. The winter was the worst of it. Western Washington in November and December carries a cold that is not the dry, sharp cold of other climates, but something wet and penetrating that gets into the seams of your jacket and the upholstery of old cars, and the spaces between your thoughts if you sit still long enough. We parked behind a strip mall on Pacific Avenue and slept in shifts, one of us always partially awake watching. I was making $11 an hour at Russo's. It was enough for food barely and for the gas that kept us from freezing when the temperature dropped below 40. It was not enough for rent. It was not enough for the medications that Reeve began to need in January, when the cold that had been sitting in his chest since December finally declared itself as something serious. The coughing started quietly. By February, it was not quiet at all. He would wake in the back seat at 2 in the morning with his hand pressed against his sternum, his face tight with effort, trying to muffle the sound so I could sleep. I could hear it anyway. I always heard it. The clinic on 4th Avenue was the kind of place that existed in the gaps between official systems. A converted storefront, no insurance required, cash only. A doctor whose license had come from somewhere I didn't ask about, but whose diagnosis was thorough and whose recommendations were sound. Bacterial pneumonia, early stage. Antibiotics, rest, warmth if possible. Rest and warmth were not things we had in any reliable quantity. But I got the antibiotics. I was donating plasma twice a week at a center on Commerce Street that paid $40 per session for new donors and $25 for returns. The waiting room at 7 in the morning told its own story. Men whose hands showed decades of hard labor. A young mother keeping one eye on the door while her child slept across 2 chairs. A veteran near the window who returned every week with the same magazine and never seemed to reach the last page. I learned not to look too long at anyone. We were all there for the same reason, and none of us wanted to discuss it. I sat in the plastic chair and let them put the needle in my arm and thought about the fact that the man who had done this to us was, at that moment, almost certainly eating breakfast in a warm kitchen while someone else made his coffee. By late March, Reeve was better. Not well. Better. The cough had moved from something that frightened me to something that merely worried me, which felt, by that point in the winter we had just survived, like a genuine victory. The work at Russo's was good in the way that physical work is good when everything else in your life has become abstract and frightening. It was immediate, it was solvable, and it responded to effort. A car came in broken and left fixed. There was a satisfaction in that which I had not expected and which I held on to with both hands through those months. Bill Russo never spoke much, but he showed me things. How to listen to an engine the way you listen to a person who isn't telling you everything. How to read the underside of a vehicle for the history of its use. How to work a breaker bar against a corroded bolt with patience rather than force. Small educations, the kind that stay with you. I was under the frame of a GMC pickup, working a particularly stubborn bolt on a Tuesday morning in early April, when I heard tires on the lot that didn't belong. I slid out from under the truck and stood up, wiping my hands on a shop rag. The Lincoln Town Car was long and black and recently detailed, moving carefully across the oil-stained concrete as though the pavement itself was beneath it. A car that had no business on this lot in Tacoma. The man who stepped out was in his mid-50s, wearing a charcoal suit cut close enough to have been tailored, dark shoes with a recent shine, a leather briefcase that had not been purchased at an airport. He moved with the unhurried precision of someone who charged by the hour and had never needed to justify the rate. He introduced himself as Shelton Briggs of Briggs & Colton, Probate and Estate Law, Seattle. The name Briggs meant nothing to me, but the words probate and estate landed with weight. Those were the words that lived in the territory of death, of things left behind, of the past reaching forward into the present with documents and intentions. My name made his expression shift, just slightly, just enough to tell me he had been looking for me specifically and had confirmed what he was looking for. He opened the briefcase and removed a thick manila envelope sealed with dark burgundy wax, pressed with what looked like an old letter seal. The kind of detail that belonged to a different century, to a man who had done everything with deliberate intention. Your grandfather, he said, Arthur Vance. He passed away in the spring of 2016. His will contained a specific provision, a sealed codicil, kept entirely separate from the primary estate. The instructions were explicit. This envelope was to be delivered to you and your brother only upon the legal severance of both of you from the Harrington estate or upon your 25th birthdays, whichever came first. I stood there with motor oil on my hands and looked at the envelope. Arthur Vance was our mother's father. He was also, by the official account of everyone inside the Harrington household, a man who had lost his grip on reality sometime in his late 50s and retreated into the mountains to live out whatever remained of his years in isolation. Richard had mentioned him twice in my memory, once to explain why he was no longer welcome at the estate, and once in a conversation I was not supposed to hear, when I was about 12, in which Richard referred to him as a paranoid old fool who had made his choices and would die alone with them. We were told he had died several years before that. We were not invited to a service because Richard had made sure there was no service for us to attend. I took the envelope. Briggs waited while I broke the wax seal. Inside was a heavy iron key, the kind of key that suggested not a door but an era, forged from something that had been made to last and weighted accordingly, and a folded sheet of paper printed with GPS coordinates, and beneath that, a handwritten letter on sheets of yellowed legal paper. The lines close and careful, the handwriting angular and precise in the way of someone who had spent a lifetime drafting technical specifications. Elena and Reeve, the letter began. My full name written in his handwriting, a name I had not seen written by anyone who loved me in a very long time. If you are reading this, then Richard has finally shown you the thing I always knew was underneath the surface. I am sorry I could not protect you from him while I was still breathing. They told you I was paranoid. They told you I was lost. Let them believe it. I spent the last 20 years of my life making sure that if the day ever came when he threw you to the wolves, you would have something waiting. The coordinates will take you to Oak Haven, my cabin in the Blackwood Mountains. Do not use the main roads. Do not tell anyone where you are going. What you find inside will change everything, but only if you are willing to do the hard work of finding it. Endure. Grandpa Arthur. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope with the key and the coordinates. Briggs was watching me with an expression of practiced neutrality, the face of a man who had delivered news like this before and understood that silence was the right response. I asked him one question. I asked him whether he worked for Richard. He held my eyes and said that his firm had been retained by Arthur Vance 20 years ago through a separate trust structure that Richard Harrington had no legal knowledge of and no access to. I nodded. I thanked him. He got back in the Lincoln and drove off the lot the same way he had come, slowly, carefully, as though the pavement deserved consideration. I stood in the bay for a long time after he left. I held the envelope and felt the weight of the iron key pressing against the paper from inside. Heavier than it looked. Heavier than a key had any practical reason to be. Then I walked to the car. Reeve was in the passenger seat with his sketchbook open on his knee. He looked up when I opened the door, and he saw something in my face that made him put the notebook down without a word. I handed him the letter. He read it slowly. When he finished, he read it again. Then he looked at the key still pressing against the envelope. What is Oak Haven? He asked. I don't know yet, I said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the gray April sky above the strip mall. Then he said, he knew. Arthur knew Richard would do this someday. He built something before it happened. Yes, I said. That's exactly what it sounds like. Do you think he was actually crazy? Reeve asked. I shook my head. I think he was the only person in this family who was paying close enough attention, I said. We had $47 between us. I spent 31 of it on a full tank of gas and 2 cans of bear repellent at a sporting goods outlet on the highway. At the same store, I bought a paper topographic map from the rack near the register and spread it across the hood of the Civic in the parking lot, cross-referencing the GPS coordinates from Arthur's letter against the terrain features printed on the paper. The cabin was in the Blackwood Range, deep in the Snoqualmie backcountry, well past the end of any maintained road. I copied the coordinates onto the inside of my forearm in ballpoint pen, and we left Tacoma at noon. The drive east took us out of the rain and into the lower reaches of the mountains, where the highway gave way to state routes, and the state routes narrowed to county roads, and the county roads became single-lane passages through walls of Douglas fir so tall that the afternoon light came down in thin, separate shafts between the branches, like something falling through the clerestory windows of a very old church. The GPS signal fragmented after the first hour. By the second hour, it was gone entirely, and I drove by the topographic map and the coordinates on my arm and the instinct that had been developing through the afternoon that we were moving in the right direction. The road changed from cracked asphalt to gravel, then from gravel to packed dirt, then from packed dirt to 2 compressed ruts running through undergrowth that pressed against both sides of the car. The Civic's suspension registered every rock and root. I kept the speed low and the windows down because the air in that forest had a quality that was different from anything I had breathed in the preceding 5 months. Older, denser, as though it had been moving through those same trees for long enough to have become something more than just air. Reeves said nothing for the last 40 minutes of the drive. He watched the forest through his window with the concentrated stillness I recognized from his sketching, the face of someone receiving more information than they can immediately process. The road ended at a rusted gate bearing a faded sign. Private property. Trespassers will be met with force. The lettering had been bleached and cracked by enough seasons that it was barely readable. I killed the engine. The silence of that forest was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a different kind of sound entirely. The slow creak of large trees moving in a wind that did not reach the ground. Something calling at a distance I couldn't identify. The soft, irregular percussion of water moving somewhere through rock. Everything else was still in a way that the city never is. A stillness that had weight and age and did not apologize for itself. "Are you sure?" Reeve asked. "We have nothing left to lose," I said. We climbed the gate. The rust left orange marks on my palms when I gripped the top bar. We walked the last half-mile through the trees, following the compressed ruts, the bear spray in my jacket pocket, and the envelope with the iron key pressed against my chest. The ridge crested and Oak Haven came into view below us, and I stopped walking because what I was looking at was not what the name had led me to picture. It was not a cabin in any familiar sense. It was not a retreat. It was a structure built by someone who had anticipated being found and had made finding it as difficult as possible. The foundation was poured concrete, thick and deliberate, the work of an engineer rather than a home builder. The walls were heavy-gauge timber, but the windows, only 3 of them, had been covered from the outside with steel plate bolted directly into the framing. The roof was blanketed in moss and accumulated pine needles so thick that from any distance, in any season other than the deep white of winter, the structure would simply disappear into the forest floor around it. This was not a place someone had built to live in comfortably. This was a place someone had built to protect something that needed protecting. We came down off the ridge and approached the front. The door was solid oak, dense as a bank vault panel, with no visible handle and no hinge from the outside. Just the iron deadbolt lock, with a keyhole that matched, in shape and scale and evident age, the iron key in my pocket. I slid the key in. It required both hands turning together, and the resistance was not the resistance of a lock that had seized with disuse, but the deliberate resistance of a mechanism engineered to require effort, to resist anything less than intention. There was a series of internal movements, clicks, shifts, a sequence that felt architectural in its complexity, and then the tumblers aligned with a sound like something heavy and final settling into place, and the bolt drew back. The door swung inward on hinges I couldn't see, heavy and perfectly counterbalanced, releasing a wave of cold and still air that carried the mineral smell of sealed spaces and old paper and something metallic underneath, something I would later identify as the particular scent of a room that has been holding the same air for years. I clicked on the flashlight I had taken from Russo's tool chest that morning. The beam swept the interior. The room was warm in the sense that it had once been warm. The furniture intact, the proportions domestic, the arrangement suggesting habitation rather than storage. A leather armchair near the fireplace with a book open on the armrest. A dining table with a ceramic mug still sitting on it, as though its owner had stepped away for a moment and expected to return. Shelves of books running floor to ceiling. Engineering texts, philosophy, American history, a complete set of topographic atlases for the Pacific Northwest. A pair of reading glasses folded on a newspaper. Everything covered in a uniform layer of gray dust, settled evenly over every surface with the patient thoroughness of years passing without witness. The room had the quality not of deliberate preservation, but of simple abandonment, as though someone had walked out one ordinary morning and the world had quietly continued without them. It did not look like salvation. It looked like a very old, very quiet room at the end of a road that no longer existed on any map. "Reeve," I said, but he was already pointing. He was standing near the fireplace, and he was looking at the floor. The dust that lay undisturbed across every surface in that room lay undisturbed across the floorboards also, except for one place. In front of the right side of the large stone fireplace, the dust had been swept in a precise arc. Not smeared by accident, not scuffed by casual movement, swept cleanly in a perfect half circle, originating from the right edge of the hearth structure. The fireplace was not flush with the wall. I stepped closer and brought the flashlight beam down to the floor. The scratch marks were there, microscopic lines in the hardwood of the kind left by stone on wood when stone is moved repeatedly across the same path over many years. The massive hearth structure had moved before, many times, on a hinge. My heart was doing something I did not have a precise word for. Not fear, not excitement, but something that occupied the narrow territory between the two, where the body cannot reliably distinguish which one it is responding to. I ran my hands along the stones of the fireplace, looking for the thing that was not stone. At shoulder height, on the right side, my fingertips found it, a surface cold in the wrong way. Not the cool of rock, but the cool of steel, painted and textured to approximate the surrounding stone with the precision of someone who understood material properties at a professional level. A panel the size of a playing card. I pressed it. The hydraulic release came from deep inside the wall, a sound of pressure equalizing, of a system engaging that had been dormant for years but maintained for exactly this moment. The floor vibrated slightly beneath my feet. The right half of the stone fireplace swung outward on its hidden hinge, with a grinding of stone on aged wood, slow and immense and inevitable. Behind it, a doorway cut into concrete. Beyond the doorway, steps descending into darkness. Cold air moved upward from below, dry and clean and carrying that metallic ozone scent, stronger now, the smell of a sealed space holding something it had been trusted with for a long time. I looked at Reeve. He looked at me. "Stay close," I said, and I started down. The steps were 20 in total. I counted them without deciding to, the way the mind reaches for numbers when everything familiar has been replaced by the unfamiliar. Each step was poured concrete, slightly rough, descending at a measured angle into a darkness that the flashlight beam could not fully penetrate from above. The walls on either side were the same poured concrete as the foundation. No seams, no joints, engineered as a single continuous structure that had been designed not for convenience but for permanence. Reeve followed close behind me. I could hear his breathing, controlled, deliberate, his body managing what his voice would not say. The temperature dropped with each step. By the time we reached the bottom, the air was cold enough that our breath showed in the flashlight beam as thin white dispersing clouds. I stepped off the last stair and swept the beam across the room. It stopped me completely. The space was larger than the cabin above, extending further in every direction than the footprint of the structure overhead would have suggested, which meant Arthur had excavated beyond the building's perimeter, had carved this room out of the mountain itself. The ceiling was 8 feet high, the floor was smooth concrete, and every wall from floor to ceiling was covered. Not decorated, covered. The way a room is covered when a single mind has been working on a single problem for 20 years and has run out of other ways to hold all of it. Photographs, hundreds of them, pinned in overlapping arrangements. Shipping containers on dockyard platforms, men in suits outside government buildings and hotel lobbies, aerial views of port facilities, close-up photographs of documents that had clearly been captured through glass or from across distances. Bank statements organized by date and secured with rusting binder clips. Manifests, shipping manifests, cargo manifests, documents bearing the Harrington and Low letterhead that I recognized from the filing system I had been taught to navigate at 14 when Richard began bringing me to the offices on weekends under the pretense of education. Red string connecting everything, faces to dates, dates to account numbers to the names of companies registered in places I would need to look up. It was not the work of a paranoid man. That was the first thing that struck me, and it struck me with force. A paranoid man's evidence wall looks like fear, connection invented where none exists, pattern imposed on randomness, the mind manufacturing meaning from noise. This was its opposite. This was an engineer's approach to documentation. Systematic, hierarchical, cross-referenced, every photograph labeled in small, precise print, every document dated and indexed, every line of red string anchored at both ends to something verifiable. In the center of the room sat a Mosler safe, roughly the size of a small refrigerator, the kind of safe that had been built in the middle of the last century, not for convenience, but for the kind of permanence that outlasts the people who ordered it. The brass dial was heavy, with the deliberate resistance of serious engineering. On top of the safe sat a single black leather ledger, sewn binding, no markings on the cover. I walked to the safe and picked up the ledger. My hands were steady. I do not entirely understand why they were steady. Everything in my body, by any reasonable accounting, should have been shaking. I opened to the first page. The date at the top read July 14th, 1999. The handwriting was the same as the letter, angular and precise, the penmanship of someone who had spent a career producing technical documentation and brought that same exacting standard to everything he wrote. Richard Harrington is not a businessman. He is a butcher. The empire is built on blood. I read the next 3 pages without stopping. Then I stopped because what I was reading required stillness before I could continue. Not emotional stillness. I was past the point where emotion would have helped. But the stillness of someone who needs to hold a very large thing carefully before they can carry it. Arthur Vance had spent the years between 1999 and 2016 compiling a complete and documented record of Richard Harrington's second enterprise, the one that ran parallel to the legitimate logistics operation, invisible beneath it, using its infrastructure and its hard-won respectability as cover. The ships that moved Harrington and low cargo through the ports of Seattle and Long Beach were also, on selected routes, moving military-grade weapons. Not hunting rifles, not civilian firearms. Military hardware, the kind that arrived in the hands of people in places where such things are not supposed to arrive through commercial channels. The weapons were concealed within agricultural shipments, grain equipment, farm machinery. The documentation showed in precise detail how cargo manifests were altered at the point of origin, how container seals were managed, which port inspectors received payments and in what amounts, and through which intermediary accounts spread across 3 countries. The dates ran from the early 90s through 2015, the last year Arthur had been able to document. And then, in a section marked simply November 2011, a different kind of entry. 2 names. Dock workers at the Port of Seattle. Men flagged in an internal Harrington and low safety audit for noting irregularities in certain container loading procedures. Men who had been referred to the FBI's Seattle field office and had agreed to provide testimony. Men who had died within 6 weeks of each other in what the official records described as separate accidents. Below their names, Arthur had written a single sentence in handwriting slightly less controlled than the rest, as though the hand that formed those words had not been entirely steadied before it began. Signed by Richard Harrington. I have the original authorization. Reeve had come to stand beside me. He was reading over my shoulder. I felt him go very still in a way that was different from his earlier stillness. Not the managed quiet of someone holding themselves together, but the absolute stillness of someone who has just understood something that cannot be unknown. We were not just holding evidence. We were holding the documented anatomy of a criminal organization that had operated for more than 2 decades inside the respectable shell of a publicly admired company. We were holding proof of murder. And we were 18 years old, standing in a concrete room underground in the middle of a national forest, and no one in the world knew we were there. And then the footsteps started above us, heavy, deliberate, moving across the floorboards of the cabin in a pattern that communicated knowledge of the layout. Not exploration, not uncertainty, but the movement of someone who had been here before or had studied the plans carefully enough to know where to go. I clicked off the flashlight. The darkness arrived immediately and completely, the kind with physical presence, the kind that pressed against the eyes. Beside me, Reeve put his hand on my arm. I could feel his pulse in his fingertips. The hydraulic mechanism at the top of the stairs engaged, the sound of the fireplace swinging outward. Then a beam of light, white, tactical, far brighter than my flashlight, swept down the stairwell. Elena. Reeve. The voice was smooth and entirely unhurried, and I placed it without difficulty. Shelton Briggs, the probate attorney in the charcoal suit who had found me at Russo's garage 4 hours ago, who had told me with steady eyes that his firm had been retained by Arthur Vance through a trust structure Richard had no knowledge of. "You don't need to hide," he said. His voice was descending the stairs. "It's dark down there. Let me bring some light to the situation." He reached the bottom, and the tactical light found us. Found me standing at the safe with the ledger in my hands and Reeve behind me against the far wall. In the reflected glow, I could see Briggs clearly. The suit was the same charcoal suit. The briefcase was gone. In his right hand, held with the practiced ease of someone who had held one many times before, was a matte black pistol fitted with a suppressor. He was not a probate attorney. Or perhaps he was, and he was also this. People are rarely only one thing, and the 2 things are not always in conflict. He looked at the ledger in my hands, and something crossed his face that might have been relief. "Arthur Vance was a remarkable engineer," Briggs said, "and a genuinely careful man. For 8 years, your father has known that Arthur compiled something, a complete record, documented and sourced, the kind that ends careers and begins federal investigations. We searched his old office in Bellingham. his apartment in Portland, his storage unit in Olympia twice over 2 years. Nothing. He took a measured step toward us. The gun maintained its aim at the center of my chest with the relaxed steadiness of someone who was not concerned about the outcome of this conversation. Then Arthur's will activated, Briggs continued. And the interesting part, the part that was genuinely elegant, was the trigger condition. The envelope would only be released if Richard legally severed you from the estate. Richard didn't want to disown you, Elena. He had to. It was the only mechanism that would release the coordinates. He needed you to find this room so that we could come here and recover what Arthur hid. I stood very still and processed what he was saying against everything I believed I understood about the last 5 months. The night of our birthday, the slap, the iron gate closing in the rain. Richard had known about the codicil. He had known the only path to Arthur's evidence was through the delivery condition, and the delivery condition required legally removing us from the estate, which meant the cruelty of that night, the theatrical public expulsion, had not been impulsive rage. It had been calculation wearing the costume of rage. We had been used, aimed at this room like instruments, pointed and released. Every morning in that garage, every needle in my arm at the plasma center, every night listening to Reeve cough in the back seat of the Civic. Every single day of it had been a component of Richard Harrington's operation to retrieve his father-in-law's evidence and destroy it. The realization did not make me afraid. It made me cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Slide the ledger across the floor, Briggs said, then step back from the safe. What happens to us after that? Reeve asked. His voice was even. Briggs said nothing. The silence was the answer, and we both heard it clearly. We were loose ends. Richard had demonstrated twice over, once with the dock workers in 2011 and once with the Iron Gate in the November rain, that people who became inconvenient to him simply ceased to be relevant. I am not going to give you anything, I said. I slipped my right hand into my jacket pocket. The bear spray canister was there, 12 ounces, 30-foot range, high concentration capsaicin. The man at the sporting goods store had explained the specifications with the mild efficiency of someone describing a routine product. I had bought it for bears. Elena, Briggs said, you are an intelligent young woman in a room with no exits. I will not ask again. I know, I said. Reeve, down. I pulled the canister from my pocket, cleared the safety in the same motion, and released the trigger in a sustained burst aimed directly at Shelton Briggs's face from 8 feet away. The effect was immediate and comprehensive. A dense reddish-orange cloud hit him across the eyes and nose and mouth simultaneously, and the sound he produced was not quite a scream, but something from the same register. A raw, involuntary exhalation of pure distress as the capsaicin reached his eyes and the exposed tissue of his airways at the same moment. His trigger finger contracted. The suppressed shot was quieter than I expected, a compressed, percussive sound, more mechanical than violent. I felt the air displacement near my left shoulder, and the concrete wall behind me produced a spray of fragments, one of which opened a thin cut along my neck that I would not notice for another 20 minutes. Briggs was clawing at his face with his left hand, the gun swinging without direction in his right, his footing unstable as his body redirected all available resources toward managing what was happening to his eyes and airways. He was still standing. The gun was still in his hand. I crossed the distance in 2 steps. 18 months at Russo's had taught me that leverage matters more than strength when dealing with something heavier and more resistant than you are. I got my left hand on his right wrist before the gun came back level and drove it upward and back while I rotated into his center of gravity. He went sideways, not down. He had mass and even compromised he used it, his shoulder hitting the concrete wall hard. The gun went up and the next shot, another involuntary discharge as he fought for balance, went into the ceiling and brought concrete dust down on both of us. I had both hands on his wrist. I drove his hand back against the wall once, with focused deliberation, and the gun hit concrete and his grip released, and it skittered across the floor. Reeve moved. He had crossed to the far side of the room while I engaged Briggs, and he came back with the gun from the floor and Briggs's own belt in his other hand, moving with a speed and decisiveness I had not seen from him before. That gentle boy who moved worms off sidewalks, moving now with the clarity of someone who understands exactly what is at stake. He kept the gun trained on Briggs with both hands, while I used the belt and the shoelaces pulled from Briggs's own shoes to bind his wrists and ankles, with a thoroughness that left no room for reconsideration. Briggs was on the floor, unable to see, struggling to breathe, secured. I took the gun from Reeve. I took Briggs's phone from his jacket pocket, his car keys, his wallet. The phone had no signal, as expected, but it had a battery, a camera, and the contact list of a man who worked for Richard Harrington, which was its own form of intelligence. I stood up and faced the Mosler safe. 3 million in untraceable bearer bonds, Arthur's letter had said. The safe contains what you need to stay alive. We needed the combination. I had already tried 3 sequences: birth years, dates associated with Arthur's professional history, and the Mosler had not moved. It was a serious lock on a serious safe, and it was not going to yield to approximation. Reeve was standing beside me, looking at the brass dial. His breathing had steadied. The acute phase had passed and something more operational had settled in. The body accepting that the immediate crisis was behind us and that the next problem was a different kind of problem. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you remember the packages?" I looked at him. "Every year on our birthday," he said. Since we were old enough to notice, there would be a package at the gate, no name on it, brown paper with our names in block letters. Richard always had Mrs. Aldridge take them away before we could reach them, but we saw them a few times before she did. Small packages, flat ones. Reeve reached out and rested his fingertips lightly on the dial without turning it. Arthur never missed a birthday, not a single one, even when he wasn't permitted anywhere near us. He kept track of us. He always kept track. He knew exactly when our 18th birthday was. He knew it was the date Richard would act. It was the date he had built the codicil around, the date written into the trigger condition of everything in this room. I put my hand on the dial. 12, I said. 11, 18. Day, month, year. Our birthday. The day we were put out into the rain. The day Arthur had known for years was the day this room would need to open. I turned the dial right to 12, left to 11, right to 18. The Mosler opened. Not dramatically, not with any sound beyond the soft, precise click of engineering doing exactly what it had been designed to do. The door swung on its counterbalance hinges and held itself open, and the interior was dry and cold and organized with the same meticulous care as everything else Arthur had built in this place. On the lower shelf, sealed in vacuum-formed plastic, the bearer bonds, bundled and labeled in Arthur's small, precise handwriting. On the shelf above, 3 external hard drives in individual static-proof bags, each labeled with a date range and subject category. Beside the drives, a row of audio cassette tapes in plastic cases, each labeled with a name and a date. Names I recognized from the Harrington and Low organizational structure, board members and port officials, and at least 2 names I associated with state government. And on the top shelf alone, set slightly apart from everything else, a small white envelope. Standard drugstore variety, the kind that comes in boxes of 100. A single name on the front in the same angular handwriting, but written smaller than the rest, with more care, as though this particular piece of writing had mattered to him differently than the documentation. Elena. I stood looking at it. Reeve saw it at the same moment and said nothing, which was exactly right. I took the envelope from the shelf and placed it in the interior pocket of my jacket, against my chest, next to Arthur's first letter. I was not ready to open it. Whatever it contained was something I needed to receive somewhere other than a concrete room with a bound man on the floor and concrete dust settling in my hair. We packed everything from the safe into Briggs's leather briefcase. The bonds, the hard drives, the tapes, the ledger. I took one last look at the walls, at 20 years of documented truth, at the map of a crime that had run beneath the surface of a respected name for longer than I had been alive, maintained in secret by a man who everyone around him had dismissed as lost. I turned off the flashlight. We climbed the stairs. We locked the cabin door from the outside with Arthur's iron key. We left Briggs in the dark, secured and temporarily blind, with no one within miles to hear him. We walked back through the forest to the rusted gate, climbed over it, and drove out of the Blackwood Mountains in Shelton Briggs's Lincoln Town car, leaving the Civic in the trees behind us. Neither of us spoke for the first 40 minutes. The forest moved past the windows in the last of the afternoon light, the Douglas firs enormous and unhurried, the road gradually resolving from ruts to packed dirt to gravel to asphalt as we descended back toward the world where things happen on schedules. Then Reeves said quietly, "He planned all of it." Arthur. He planned for Richard to disown us. He planned for us to find that room. He planned for everything to happen exactly as it did. Yes, I said. He spent 20 years doing that. Yes. Another mile of forest passing in silence. For us, Reeve said. Not as a question. For us, I said. We drove out of the mountains as the sun dropped behind the ridge, the peaks darkening in the rearview mirror, the lights of the lowland beginning to appear through the trees. The world was the same world it had been this morning, but we were not the same people. I need a hospital, Reeve said after a while. He said it the way he said most things. Not urgently, just as information being offered. I know, I said. Portland first. The private clinic in the Pearl District asked no questions when I placed $10,000 in cash, liquidated the following morning from a single bearer bond at a specialist broker on Burnside, who handled such instruments with the incurious efficiency of a man who had seen considerably stranger things, on their reception counter. They admitted Reeve, gave him a private room, and had intravenous antibiotics running within the hour. A doctor with careful hands and a measured manner told me the underlying pneumonia had resolved, but the secondary inflammation in his airways needed a full treatment course and genuine rest. Rest, I said. He needs at minimum 3 days, she said. Ideally 5. I pulled the chair beside his bed close and sat there while the IV ran, and the monitoring equipment made its quiet, rhythmic sounds, and Reeves slept with the particular depth that comes when a body finally accepts the care it has been rationing itself against for months. Outside the window, Portland moved through its ordinary evening, entirely unaware of what was sitting in the chair beside a hospital bed on the 4th floor. I opened Arthur's ledger on my lap and read it from the beginning. I read it the way Arthur had written it, systematically, completely without skipping. It took 4 hours. By the end, I had a complete understanding of the architecture of what Richard had built and the precise nature of what Arthur had assembled against it. The hard drives would need to be decrypted, which required equipment I didn't have access to. The cassette tapes were analog, requiring playback equipment that was increasingly difficult to find. But the ledger itself was complete and sourced and authenticated. The bank statements bore certification stamps from institutions in 3 countries. The original manifests were signed and dated. This was not evidence that a competent lawyer could dismantle with procedural challenges. This was the kind of evidence that ended things permanently. At the back of the ledger, in a section Arthur had simply labeled Next Steps, I found the name, circled twice in red ink with a margin note in his handwriting alongside it. Honest, unbribable. Has been working this case from the outside for years. She needs the final piece. Special Agent Corinne Hadley, FBI Financial Crimes Division, Seattle Field Office. Below the name, Arthur had written a direct extension number and a note beneath it. Call from a line that cannot be traced to you. Read her the Cayman routing number on page 47 before you say anything else. She will know immediately what it means. She has been waiting for this number for a long time. I looked at the extension number. I looked at Reeve asleep in the bed, his color already better than it had been in months, his breathing audible and even. I took Briggs's phone, no password, he had not expected to lose it, and dialed. 2 rings, then a woman's voice, direct and alert in the register of someone who answers with the assumption that the call might matter. Hadley. I read her the routing number from page 47 of Arthur's ledger. 18 digits, spoken clearly and without preamble or explanation. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Corinne Hadley said, in a voice that had shifted entirely from the one she had answered with, "Who is this, and where are you calling from?" "My name is Elena Vance," I said. "Arthur Vance was my grandfather. He tried to get this documentation to you before he died. He ran out of time. I have everything he compiled. All of it. The manifests, the account records, the authentication documentation, and the original signed authorization orders for the 2 murders in November 2011. A shorter silence this time. "How much is everything?" she asked. 20 years, I said, documented and cross-referenced. 3 encrypted hard drives, original shipping manifests, certified bank records across 3 jurisdictions, and a handwritten ledger covering the complete operational structure from the early 90s through 2015. I heard something on the line, the sound of a door or a chair or both. "Where are you right now?" she said. "Portland," I said, "but I'm not bringing this to your office." She waited. Harrington and Lowe holds their annual shareholder summit in 3 weeks, I said. Emerald Tower, downtown Seattle. Richard will be giving the keynote address. I want you in the lobby at 11:30 that morning. I will hand you everything there. But the arrest happens in that room, in front of those people. No quiet processing, no sealed arrangement, public. The line was quiet long enough that I began to consider whether she was consulting someone or running a trace or both. I don't take operational direction from civilians, she said finally. Her voice was flat. I understand that, I said. But Arthur spent 20 years building this case so that Richard Harrington would face consequences proportionate to what he actually did. A quiet arrest and a sealed cooperation agreement does not accomplish that. If you won't agree to this, I will contact the Seattle Times and the Securities and Exchange Commission simultaneously tomorrow morning and provide them with everything, and the Bureau will be explaining to the Senate Judiciary Committee why an international arms trafficking network operated through one of the largest commercial ports on the West Coast for 2 decades without producing a single federal indictment. The silence this time was different in quality. Not hesitation, calculation. 11:30, Hadley said. Lobby of the Emerald Tower. Bring everything. I set Briggs's phone down on the arm of the chair. Outside the window, Portland continued its ordinary Thursday night without any awareness of what had just been arranged inside a hospital room on its 4th floor. The ledger was open on my lap to page 47. Reeves' monitoring equipment kept its soft, steady rhythm. Arthur had planned for this call as well, had known the evidence alone was not sufficient, that it needed to arrive in the right hands through a channel that ensured it would be used correctly rather than managed into irrelevance. He had known that an FBI agent who had been building an incomplete case for years would respond differently to this routing number than to any amount of correspondence or official contact. He had planned the leverage as carefully as he had planned the evidence. He had planned for a phone call from Portland, made by his granddaughter, 3 weeks before a shareholder summit. He had planned for everything. I put the ledger aside and looked at the small white envelope in my jacket's interior pocket, still sealed, still waiting, with my name on it in his careful handwriting. Not yet, I thought. Not quite yet. The 3 weeks between Portland and the morning of the summit were the strangest of my life, which was a significant statement given that I had recently spent 5 months sleeping in a car in Tacoma. Reeves' treatment ran its full prescribed course. By the 5th day, he was sitting up in bed with his sketchbook across his knees, which I knew meant the worst was behind him. He had been drawing since we could hold pencils. It was the language he used for processing the things that were too large or too complex for ordinary words, and the things he drew during those days in Portland told me everything about where his mind was. The forest, the cabin seen from the ridge, the stairwell descending into darkness, the safe door swinging open. He was working through it the way he worked through everything, by translating experience into image until it became something he could hold at arm's length and examine. I made one trip back to Tacoma to settle things with Bill Russo and retrieve our remaining belongings from the Civic. Bill looked at me when I came to collect the last of our things, and he looked at the Lincoln Town car parked at the curb outside, and he said nothing at all, which was the most eloquent response he had available, and the one I most appreciated. I left him an envelope with 3 months' worth of what he had paid me and told him I hoped Sargent was doing well. He nodded once. That was our goodbye, complete and sufficient. We stayed in a hotel in the Pearl District, registered under names that were not ours, paying in cash. The room had 2 beds and a window that looked out over the Willamette River, and it felt, in the compressed, provisional way of those weeks, like a country we had made for ourselves, temporary and ours. The hard drives required a decryption specialist, a man in Northeast Portland who worked from a converted garage and whose rates reflected his skill, and whose discretion reflected his understanding of the kinds of clients his skill attracted. He was recommended by the bond broker on Burnside, as though recommending a dentist, naturally without elaboration. He worked through the 3 drives over 4 days and produced printed summaries running to nearly 300 pages that corroborated everything in Arthur's ledger and added substantial detail besides. Wire transfer records with routing documentation. Internal communications between Richard and the intermediaries he used for the weapons transactions. Photographs Arthur had taken through windows and across distances in hotel lobbies and parking structures, meetings that were never supposed to exist being documented by a man in an unremarkable coat who moved carefully and was never noticed. I organized everything into a presentation structure. Not for the FBI, who would organize it themselves according to their own protocols, but for myself. I needed to understand the complete shape of what Richard had built before I stood in the same room with him. The shape of the thing he had chosen to be, underneath the philanthropy and the magazine covers in the children's hospital wing. I needed to know it entirely so that I could carry it without flinching. Corinne Hadley called twice during those 3 weeks on the burner phone I had purchased in Portland for this purpose. The calls were brief and professional. She confirmed the summit date and the logistics. She told me the routing number I had read her had unlocked a thread in an investigation her division had been unable to complete for 6 years, and that what I was bringing them would close it and open several others. She said this without warmth, in the flat declarative register of someone exchanging operational facts, and I found I preferred it that way. I did not need warmth from her. I needed competence, and everything about Corinne Hadley suggested she had it in the quantities the situation required. On the evening before the summit, I sat on the edge of the hotel bed with a small white envelope in both hands. Reeve was at the window with his sketchbook, drawing the river in the last of the evening light. He had been drawing the river every evening for a week, not because the subject was particularly interesting to him, I thought, but because it was moving and he found the movement of water calming in the way that only certain kinds of movement are. He understood that I needed the room to be quiet without me having to ask him for it. I had been carrying the envelope against my chest for nearly 3 weeks. I had looked at my name on the front of it many times. The handwriting was the same as the letter in the ledger, angular, precise, but written smaller here, with a care that felt different from the care he had brought to the operational documents, as though this particular piece of writing had mattered to him in a register that the evidence gathering had not reached. I opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of the same yellowed legal paper as the first letter, but shorter. Not a document, not instructions or coordinates or the names of federal agents, just a few paragraphs, the ink slightly faded at the edges where the years had worked on it. Elena, it began, your mother used to send me a photograph every year on your birthday. She found ways to do it that Richard didn't know about. Small envelopes mailed from post offices across the city, never the same one twice. She was clever in that particular way. She was the cleverest person I ever knew, and I have spent 30 years being sorry that I could not protect her from the choice she made when she was too young to understand what she was choosing. I have one photograph of you. It was taken when you were 3 years old, in the greenhouse of the Mercer Island house, before Richard decided to put a lock on the door. You are looking at something outside the frame, and your expression is one I have thought about many times in the years since. Not happiness, exactly. Something more complete than happiness. The expression of a person who is fully present in a moment and knows it, without needing it to be anything other than what it is. Your mother had that same expression in certain photographs from when she was young, before things became complicated. I have kept this photograph in the left breast pocket of my work coat for 14 years. It has traveled with me to every job site through 3 states and 2 decades of bridges and river structures and flood control work, and I have looked at it more times than I could give you an accurate count of. And beneath the folded letter, pressed flat against the bottom of the envelope, was a piece of drafting paper, the thin, slightly translucent kind that engineers use for preliminary work, the kind that holds graphite well and shows the pressure of the hand that moved across it. On it was a face, my face, or the face I had worn at 3 years old, drawn from the photograph my mother had sent him in a small envelope mailed from a post office she had not used before. The lines were precise in the way all of Arthur's work was precise. No wasted movement, no uncertain marks, but there was something in them that his engineering drawings would not have had, a quality of attention that went beyond technical accuracy. The particular care of someone who has looked at a subject for a long time before putting pencil to paper, who has memorized it, who draws from love rather than observation. In the lower right corner, in his small angular hand, Elena, age 3, Mercer Island greenhouse. Last photograph before Richard locked the door. I sat with the drawing for a long time. I sat with the letter, and I sat with the drawing, and I sat with the sum of them, which was larger than either one separately. Arthur Vance had never met me. Richard had made certain of that, had cut the connection before I was old enough to know there was a connection to be cut. Arthur had known my face only from a photograph sent by a woman who had found ways to be clever about small envelopes in post offices she hadn't used before. He had carried that photograph in his breast pocket for 14 years. He had looked at it on job sites in 3 states, in the mornings before the work started, and in the evenings after it ended. And then he had come home to the mountain and gone down into the underground room and continued building the thing that would catch the man who had taken his daughter and his grandchildren away from him. He had been alone in that work for 20 years. He had been called paranoid and dismissed, and had let them dismiss him. And he had never stopped. I put the letter and the drawing back in the envelope carefully. I placed the envelope back against my chest, in the interior pocket of my jacket. "Reeve," I said. He turned from the window. "We go tomorrow," I said. He looked at my face and read what was in it without asking me to explain it, which was exactly what I needed from him. He turned back to the window and picked up his sketchbook, and we sat in the quiet of the hotel room above the river until it was late enough to sleep. The morning of the summit was clear. One of those Pacific Northwest mornings in May, when the weeks of cloud and rain withdraw suddenly and entirely, and the light arrives cold and crystalline, and the distances that the overcast had been concealing reassert themselves all at once. The Cascade Range was visible to the east, sharp and white against a sky that had decided to be genuinely blue, the snow line still high on the upper slopes. It was the kind of morning that made the region look like something that had been designed to justify the months of rain that preceded it. We dressed in suits I had purchased the previous week. Not expensive, but well-fitted and serious, the kind that communicate intention without announcement. Reeves was charcoal gray. Mine was dark navy. We looked like two people who had made decisions and understood what those decisions entailed. The drive from Portland to Seattle took just under 3 hours. We did not talk much. There was not much left to say that had not already been said in the weeks of preparation or the months before that. We were past the point where words helped. What was coming would either work or it would not, and everything that could be controlled had been controlled, and the variables that remained would declare themselves in the next few hours. The Emerald Tower occupied a full city block in Seattle's financial district, 40 stories of glass and steel catching the morning light and distributing it in moving planes across the surrounding streets. The lobby was already moving with purpose when we arrived at 11:15. Suited figures crossing the atrium with the practiced confidence of people who expected the world to accommodate their movement, journalists near the ballroom entrance with lanyards and equipment bags, security personnel whose professional composure did not entirely conceal the fact that they were continuously assessing everyone who came through the doors. We found Hadley in the glass alcove she had described, off the main lobby, left of the reception desk. She was standing with 4 people, 2 men and 2 women, all in dark jackets, positioned in the room with the particular spatial awareness that comes from training rather than instinct. Not large or imposing, just arranged so that every exit in that space was in someone's line of sight. Hadley herself was in her mid-40s, compact, unhurried, with a face built for professional neutrality, information released only on her terms. She looked at me when we approached, and I understood that she was confirming something she had formed from our phone calls against the physical reality standing in front of her. I was 18 years old. I was carrying a leather briefcase that had belonged to a man currently awaiting arraignment in a King County holding facility. I had organized evidence that she had been trying to assemble for 6 years into a format that would survive federal scrutiny. She shook my hand once, firmly. "Let's see it," she said. I opened the briefcase on the glass table. The ledger first, Arthur's original documentation, the spine around which everything else was organized. Then the printed summaries from the decrypted hard drives, organized by subject and date. Then the original manifests, authenticated and certified. Then the cassette tapes, then the photographs. Hadley's technical agent connected a portable decryption unit and spent 8 minutes confirming the hard drive data against the summaries. At the end of those 8 minutes, he looked up at Hadley, and his expression was professionally controlled. But underneath the control was something that looked like the end of a long patience. "It's all here," he said. "Shell companies, wire transfers, weapons manifests, the 2011 authorization orders. Direct forensic match to the gaps we've been carrying since the RICO investigation closed without resolution." Hadley closed the briefcase. She looked at me with an expression I had not often seen directed at me by an adult. Not sympathy, not condescension, but clean and uncomplicated regard. "Your grandfather," she said, "was a hell of an investigator." "He was an engineer," I said. "Same skill set," she said, "different application." She held the briefcase for a moment, and then she said something I had not anticipated. "Arthur Vance contacted my office in 2015, she said. "He attempted to route this documentation through proper channels, A formal transfer, clean and procedurally sound. A staffing transition buried the communication before it could be processed. I spent 3 years not knowing whether what he had built actually existed. She looked down at the briefcase in her hand. Now I know it did. She picked it up. Behind her, the four agents adjusted their positions in that coordinated, unhurried way that required no spoken coordination. "Stay behind us," she said. "When it's done, stay where you are." She did not ask if we were ready. It was not that kind of situation. The ballroom doors were open 30 feet across the lobby, and through them came the ambient sound of 500 people gathered in a space designed to hold important events. The composite murmur of conversation, the movement of serving staff, the particular acoustic quality of a room where people have gathered in the expectation that something will happen that is worth attending. We crossed the lobby. The agents spread into a formation visible only to someone looking for it. The security personnel at the ballroom entrance registered the federal credentials and stepped back. One of them reached for a radio, and an agent nearest him placed a hand briefly on his arm and shook his head once. We went through the doors. The ballroom held its 500 in round-table arrangements under chandeliers that produced warm, deliberate light, the kind that makes everything look considered and permanent. White linens, name placard cards, the corporate aesthetics of an organization that understood the staging of power as a form of power in itself. At the front of the room, on a raised stage, at a podium, stood Richard Harrington. He was mid-speech. I registered this as information, filed without coloring. Dark suit, white shirt, silver tie that matched his silver hair. Standing with the ease of a man who had occupied stages for 30 years, his hands moving in the practiced gestures of someone who has given this speech many times and understands that the delivery is as important as the content. "We are not simply moving cargo," he was saying, as the agents began their movement down the center aisle. "We are moving the future." Harrington and Lowe is built on a foundation of absolute integrity, a foundation of trust, of accountability. The words arrived and I heard them, and I will carry them for the rest of my life. Not for what they meant, but for what they were being said by, and where, and what was happening in that room while they were being said. Hadley was 20 feet from the stage when Richard's eyes moved from the audience to the agents coming toward him. The calculation that crossed his face in that moment, the rapid sequential assessment of what he was seeing, what it meant, what options remained, took approximately 2 seconds and produced nothing of use to him. There were no options. He had built his entire strategy around the assumption that Arthur's evidence would never surface. Because Arthur was dead, and paranoid old fools who died alone in mountain cabins did not surface evidence from beyond the grave. He had been wrong about that. Everything that followed from that error was arithmetic. Richard Harrington. Hadley's voice cut through the ballroom with the flat authority of someone who has said words like these before and understands their specific gravity. The room went silent in stages, the silence spreading outward from the stage like a wave. People near the front first, then the middle tables, then the back, until the entire ballroom was holding its breath in the specific way that 500 people hold their breath when they understand that something is happening that they did not come here to witness. "You are under arrest for racketeering, international arms trafficking, bribery of federal officials, and conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree." The agents were on the stage. Security personnel who had been stationed at the room's perimeter moved toward them and then stopped when they saw the credentials, the calculations of hired security resolving quickly against the reality of federal jurisdiction. A journalist near the sidewall had a camera up. Then several more cameras appeared around the room as the nature of what was unfolding became clear to more of the people in it. Richard did not run. I had thought he might, had always assessed him as a man who would choose the active response, the forward motion, the aggressive option. But he stood at the podium while Hadley climbed the stage steps and her agents spread out on either side. And he stood there through the moment when the calculation completed and returned nothing. And I watched his face in that moment and saw what I had spent 18 years wondering about. I had wondered whether there was anything underneath the control, whether the composure and the polished opinions and the measured cadence and the precise cufflinks concealed something human, or whether they concealed simply more composure, all the way down to the center of him. What was underneath was fear, not performed fear, not the managed expression of a man choosing how to appear in a difficult situation. Real fear, the uncontrolled kind that arrives when the body understands something before the mind has finished processing it, the kind that cannot be adjusted or presented. His eyes moved through the room, past Hadley, past the agents, down the center aisle to where Reeve and I stood at the back of the ballroom. He looked at us for a long time, long enough that the people nearest to us began to follow his gaze, long enough that it became part of what the room would remember about that morning. I did not look away. I watched him understand, watched him trace the line, from the night in the rain at the Iron Gate, through 5 months of calculated suffering, through the underground room in the Blackwood Mountains, and the bear mace and the concrete stairs, and the Mosler safe, through Portland and the burner phone, and the 3 weeks of preparation, all the way forward to this room, this morning, this moment. Watched him understand that Arthur Vance, dismissed and called paranoid and left to build things alone in the mountains, had won, had planned the whole architecture of it from the beginning and had placed his granddaughter at its center, and she had carried it through. Hadley had the handcuffs on his wrists. She was reading him his rights in the flat professional cadence of someone performing a procedure they know completely and do not need to think about. The room was producing the sound of collective recalibration, 500 people adjusting to a new fact, cameras recording it, phones appearing throughout the room, the ambient noise of a world in the process of reorganizing itself around something it had not expected. I looked at my father's face while the steel went around his wrists. "You are no longer a Harrington," I said. I said it at normal volume. Not for the room, for him. And I watched it land, and I watched what it did to him, and then I looked away because I was finished looking at him. Reeve put his hand briefly on my shoulder and then took it away. That was sufficient. They walked Richard Harrington out through the side exit rather than the main doors, not through the assembled guests and journalists, but through the service corridor that the catering staff used. The same corridor we had been walked through on the night of our 18th birthday, when the security guards had steered us away from the party and toward the gate in the rain. I do not know whether Hadley chose that route deliberately. I decided to believe she did. What followed in the days and weeks after that morning had the quality of a controlled demolition, the kind where the charges are placed precisely and the structure descends in a sequence that was determined before the first charge was set, each collapse enabling the next, the whole thing complete before the dust has settled. The Securities and Exchange Commission moved on Harrington and Lowe assets within 48 hours, freezing accounts and initiating an audit that would ultimately span 3 continents and extend for 2 years. The board of directors, all 7 members, had resigned within the first week, 4 of them through lawyers who immediately began negotiating cooperation agreements with the federal government. The company's stock was suspended from trading and subsequently delisted. The fleet sat in its berths in Seattle and Long Beach, while federal marshals worked through 20 years of documentation that a structural engineer had assembled alone in a mountain cabin, carrying a photograph of his granddaughter in his breast pocket while he did it. Shelton Briggs was found by King County Sheriff's deputies on a logging road 12 miles from Oak Haven, 3 days after we left him in the underground room. He was severely dehydrated, his eyes still compromised from the capsaicin exposure, his charcoal suit reduced to something that no longer communicated authority or anything else. He was charged with attempted murder, criminal conspiracy, and a range of accessory charges that his own lawyers described, in the press coverage I read, as a challenging situation. He was held without bail. Richard's arraignment was covered by every outlet in the Pacific Northwest and picked up nationally within the first day. The federal charging document ran to 47 pages and named 12 co-conspirators across 4 states. His lawyers argued for bail and were denied. The judge cited flight risk, the scope of the alleged conduct, and the defendants' demonstrated willingness, on multiple documented occasions, to address inconvenient circumstances with lethal means. He sat in federal detention while his lawyers filed motions, and the world he had spent 40 years constructing was taken apart piece by piece by the same federal agencies he had spent 40 years bribing and evading. 3 years later, the jury returned a verdict after 4 days of deliberation. Racketeering, international arms trafficking, bribery of federal officials in 3 jurisdictions, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. The sentencing took place on a Tuesday morning in a federal courtroom in Seattle. Richard stood for it with his chin level and his shoulders back, and his face arranged in the composed expression of a man performing composure for the last time in a public setting. The judge sentenced him to multiple consecutive terms, the remainder of his natural life without the possibility of parole. I was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. I had given 3 days of testimony during the trial, clear, complete, without drama, the way Arthur would have approached it, and I did not need to be present for what came after. I already understood the outcome. Not because I had been certain of it, but because from the moment the Mosler safe had swung open in that underground room, I had understood what Arthur had built and what it was capable of. The evidence was too complete, the documentation too thorough, the preparation too precise. Arthur had been an engineer. He had built things intended to last. Reeve and I filed the legal paperwork to change our surnames 11 days after the arrest. The petition, the filing fee, a brief appearance before a judge who reviewed the documentation and approved it without comment. We walked out of the King County Courthouse and stood on the steps in the spring light for a moment before either of us spoke. "Vance," Reeves said. He said it the way you say a word you are testing, rolling it across the tongue to hear how it sounds in the open air. "Vance," I agreed. It fit. It had always fit. We had simply been prevented from wearing it until now. The foundation followed. Not immediately, but there were months of legal and financial processes to navigate first. The bearer bonds requiring careful documentation and tax structuring. The hard drives and cassette tapes entering federal evidence chains that would take considerable time to resolve. But the shape of the foundation was clear from the beginning, the way Arthur's underground room had been clear in its purpose from the first moment the flashlight beam had swept across its walls. The Vance Foundation was incorporated in the state of Washington. Its first purpose, legal protection and financial support for corporate whistleblowers. People who had discovered, inside the organizations where they worked, the kind of conduct that Richard had spent decades concealing, and who needed resources to bring it forward without being destroyed by the resources of the organizations they were exposing. Its second purpose, transitional housing and vocational support for displaced youth. People who had landed, through circumstances beyond their control, in the position that Reeve and I had occupied for 5 months in Tacoma. People sleeping in cars, people donating plasma to buy antibiotics for someone they loved. Agent Corinne Hadley attended the Foundation's inaugural event. She shook my hand at the door the way she had the first time, once firmly, and said that Arthur Vance had attempted to contact her office in 2015, trying to route his evidence through proper institutional channels. The communication had been lost in a staffing transition before it could be acted on. She had spent 3 years not knowing whether the evidence he had been building actually existed or whether it had died with him. Arthur had anticipated that the institutional route might fail. That was why he had built the underground room. That was why he had structured the codicil. He had not trusted the system to work correctly, and so he had built a system of his own, with his granddaughter at the center of it, and with a trust in that granddaughter that she had not known existed until a man in a charcoal suit drove a Lincoln onto an oil-stained lot in Tacoma. I went back to Oak Haven alone in October, 5 months after the arrest. Reeve offered to come, and I told him I needed the first visit to be by myself, and he received this the way he received most difficult things, completely, without requiring explanation, without taking it as rejection. I drove the Lincoln up through the mountains, through roads that narrowed as the elevation increased, and the forest pressed in on either side, until the road ended at the rusted gate with its faded sign. I climbed the gate and walked the half-mile through the trees to the ridge. Oak Haven looked the same from above, the moss and pine needles thick on the roof, the steel-plated windows, the rust on them slightly further advanced than it had been in April, the massive oak door with its iron deadbolt. But it looked different to me than it had the first time. It looked like what it was, a structure built with intention and sustained with care across 20 years by someone who understood that good things require preparation, and that preparation is itself a form of love made concrete. I unlocked the door with Arthur's key and went inside. The dust was the same, the leather chair, the ceramic mug, the reading glasses on the open newspaper, all of it preserved in the particular stillness of a place that has been waiting. Not abandoned, but waiting. I opened the windows, not the steel plates which I had brought tools to address over the coming days, but the inner frames, which moved stiffly on their hinges, but moved. October air came in, cold and carrying the scent of wet pine and the mineral quality of mountain air after rain. It moved through the room and lifted the settled dust from every surface in thin dispersing clouds, the way breath moves through a space that has been too long closed. I found the woodpile behind the cabin under an overhang that had kept it dry through however many seasons had passed since Arthur last stacked it. The wood was dense and split to a length that fit the stone fireplace exactly. He had cut it himself to his own specifications, and the dimensions were precise. I brought in 6 pieces and built the fire the way I had learned at 10 years old from a book in the Mercer Island Library, before Richard decided the family room fireplace was a liability. Paper at the center, kindling over it in a loose arrangement that allowed air to circulate. The larger pieces angled above. A single match. The fire took immediately. The flue was clear, maintained, even in the years since Arthur's death, the way things maintain themselves when they have been built with enough care and intention. The warmth moved into the room the way warmth always moves through a cold space, gradually from the center outward, claiming it by degrees. I sat in the leather chair. I placed my hands on the armrests, worn smooth in the places where hands had rested many times before. His hands, on winter evenings, reading the engineering manuals and history texts on the shelves around him, while below him in the underground room, 20 years of carefully assembled truth waited in the dark for the moment it would be needed. Outside, the forest moved in the October wind. The Douglas firs described slow arcs against the pale afternoon sky, their sound a low, continuous note between wind and wood. The sound of something very large and very patient moving in a way it has been moving for a long time and will continue moving long after the things that happened beneath it have resolved. I thought about Arthur sitting in this chair, not with grief, with recognition. He had sat here for years alone, carrying my photograph in his breast pocket, building the mechanism that would catch the man who had broken our family. He had been dismissed as paranoid. He had kept building. He had known he might not live to see it used. He had kept building anyway, because the building was what he could do, and what he could do was what he did, until he could not do it anymore. And then he had trusted someone else to finish it. The cans of paint I had brought from Seattle were in the back of the Lincoln. After the fire had warmed the room enough, I would take the front door off its hinges and sand it down and repaint it in the dark linseed oil-based exterior paint I had selected, because Arthur had noted in the margin of one of the engineering manuals on his shelf that linseed oil paint was what the old buildings used, and the old buildings were still standing. I would have the window glazing replaced before the wet season arrived in earnest. I would arrange for someone to assess the foundation drainage in the spring, because the mountains here were serious about water and the structure deserved serious attention. I would learn the names of the trees, the way Arthur had asked me to, beginning with the large Douglas fir to the east of the cabin that had grown close enough over the decades to lay its shadow across the roof in the afternoons. I reached into the interior pocket of my jacket and took out the small white envelope. I had read the letter in Portland. I knew every word of it, but I had not yet looked at what rested beneath it, the thing I had seen in the lamplight of the hotel room and had not been ready to receive. I lifted the single-folded sheet of yellowed paper and set it carefully on the armrest. Beneath it, pressed flat against the bottom of the envelope, was the piece of drafting paper. I drew it out slowly. The graphite lines were precise and sure, no wasted marks, no uncertainty anywhere in the drawing. The face of a 3-year-old girl, captured from a photograph that had traveled in a small envelope from a post office in Seattle to wherever Arthur was living at the time, sent by a woman who had found ways to be careful about such things. The curve of a cheek, the particular angle of attention in the eyes, looking at something outside the frame, fully present in whatever moment the photograph had caught. His granddaughter, who he had never been permitted to meet, drawn from the only image he had of her. In the lower right corner, in his small, precise hand, Elena, age 3, Mercer Island greenhouse. Last photograph before Richard locked the door. I sat with the drawing in my hands and looked at it for a long time. Arthur Vance had carried this image, this pencil drawing made from a photograph sent in a careful small envelope, in his breast pocket for 14 years. He had taken it to job sites in 3 states, in rain and in summer heat, across 2 decades of bridges and buildings and flood control structures. He had come home to this mountain in this cabin in this chair and gone down into the underground room and continued building the thing that would catch Richard Harrington, carrying the face of the child he had never been allowed to know. I would have it framed. I had already decided this, somewhere between Portland and now. I would hang it above the fireplace, in the space above the stone, above the hidden panel, above the mechanism that had opened everything, in the place where the evidence of his care for us was most concentrated. It belonged there. It would stay there. I folded the letter back around the drawing and placed the envelope in the interior pocket of my jacket, next to my heart, where Arthur had carried my photograph for 14 years. Outside, the large Douglas fir to the east of the cabin moved in the October wind, its upper branches describing a slow arc against the late afternoon sky. The fire had taken full hold now. The warmth moved through the room completely, into the old wood and the stone and the leather of the chair, and the accumulated stillness of the years the cabin had waited. I sat in my grandfather's chair, in my grandfather's cabin, on my grandfather's mountain, with his drawing pressed against my chest, and I let the warmth come in. I stayed until the light through the open window turned gold, and then orange, and then faded into the particular blue-gray of a mountain evening in October. I stayed until it was dark.